I buried my wife of 45 years in the pouring rain alone. Across town, my son and daughter were clinking crystal champagne flutes, celebrating the $1 million windfall they thought was coming their way. They believed I was just a grieving, senile old man who would sign whatever piece of paper they put in front of him. They forgot that I spent 40 years hunting financial criminals for a living. They forgot that I know how to spot a lie in a ledger from a mile away. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late to say sorry. If you are listening to this, hit the like button and subscribe, because what I am about to tell you is the story of how I had to teach my own children the hardest lesson of their lives. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. I would love to know who is standing with me. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and up until 3 days ago, I thought my life was over. I stood in the middle of the Greenwich Cemetery, the mud seeping over the soles of my black dress shoes. The rain in Connecticut during November is not just wet, it is bone-chilling. It finds its way under your collar and settles in your marrow. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the freezing void in my chest. Catherine. My Catherine. The woman who taught me how to dance in the kitchen. The woman who put up with my long hours during tax season. She was lying in that mahogany casket, about to be lowered into the dark earth. And I was standing there by myself. I looked at my watch. It was a heavy silver timepiece Catherine gave me for our 30th anniversary. It was 2:30 in the afternoon. The service was supposed to start at 2. The Reverend, a kind man named Miller, who had baptized both of my children, looked at me with pity in his eyes. He shifted his weight, his Bible getting damp despite the umbrella. "We should begin, Harrison," he said softly, trying not to sound impatient. "Just 5 more minutes, Reverend," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "Traffic on I-95 is terrible this time of day. They called me this morning. They promised. I was lying to a man of God, and I think he knew it. But I had to believe it. Brandon, my son, 38 years old, a man who drove a Porsche and wore Italian suits, had sworn to me over breakfast. Dad, Steph, and I are handling the flowers. We will be there early to help you greet the guests. Don't worry about a thing." Stephanie, my daughter, 35, who lived her entire life through the lens of her smartphone camera, had hugged me and said, "We love you, Daddy. We love Mom. We will be there." So where were they? The few friends who had braved the weather were huddled under a small tent 10 yards away. I could see them whispering. They were wondering why the Caldwell children, the pride and joy of Catherine's life, were missing from her final farewell. Shame burned my cheeks hotter than tears. Then my phone vibrated against my ribs. For a split second, hope surged in my chest. A flat tire, a minor accident, a road closure. Anything to explain this absence. I pulled the phone from my inside pocket, shielding the screen from the relentless rain with my trembling hand. It was not a call. It was a notification. Instagram. I stared at the screen. I don't use social media much, mostly just to see what Stephanie is up to since she rarely calls. The notification said I had been tagged in a photo. My thumb hovered over the screen. A sense of dread, heavy and metallic, settled in my stomach. I tapped the notification. The image that loaded on my screen hit me harder than a physical blow. I actually took a step back, nearly slipping in the mud. There they were. It was a selfie. Stephanie was in the foreground, holding a glass of golden liquid, with bubbles rising to the rim. She was smiling. Not a sad, brave smile for a grieving daughter. A wide, toothy, victorious grin. Behind her, leaning over a balcony railing, was Brandon. He was holding a bottle. I squinted through the rain on my glasses. It was Dom Perignon. Vintage. A bottle that costs $300. They were not in a car. They were not stuck in traffic. I tapped the photo to expand it. My old eyes might be failing, but my mind is still sharp. It is the mind of a forensic auditor. For 40 years, I looked at numbers and documents to find the truth people tried to hide. I looked at this photo and the data screamed at me. The background. It was a lake. I recognized the shoreline. That was the reservoir near the luxury estates on the north side of town, 15 miles in the opposite direction of the cemetery. The lighting. The shadows were long and cutting across the balcony floor from the west. This photo was taken minutes ago. The caption. I read the words and I felt my heart turn into a stone. Goodbye yesterday, hello, $1,000,000 future, new beginnings, legacy. They were toasting. While their mother was waiting to be put in the ground, while their father stood alone in the rain, they were drinking champagne. And not just any champagne. They were celebrating the money. The trust fund. Catherine had a family trust. It wasn't a secret. She had inherited it from her grandfather and grew it carefully over decades. It was valued at exactly $1 million. She always said it was for the family's future, for grandchildren, for emergencies. My children didn't see it as a safety net. They saw it as a lottery ticket. And now that Catherine was gone, they thought the ticket had finally been cashed. I looked at the location tag Stephanie had foolishly left on the post. The Lakeview Estate. That was the house. The ridiculous $2.5 million mansion they had been nagging us to buy for them for months. They called it the dream home. Catherine hated that house. She called it a glass cage. She told them no a dozen times, but Catherine was gone now, and they thought I was just an obstacle to be moved aside. I stood there staring at the phone until the screen went dark. The rain ran down my neck, soaking my shirt, but I didn't feel it anymore. The grief that had been drowning me for weeks suddenly evaporated. In its place, something cold and hard began to form. It was the feeling I used to get when I found a discrepancy in a CEO's tax return. It was the feeling of the hunt. Harrison the Reverend said again, his voice gentle but firm, "We really must proceed." I looked at the casket one last time. I remembered Catherine sitting in her armchair, knitting, worrying about Brandon's spending habits, worrying about Stephanie's credit card debt. She always defended them. "They are just finding their way, Harry," she would say. "Be patient." They found their way, Catherine. They found their way to a balcony with champagne while you are lying here. I put the phone back in my pocket. I buttoned my jacket. I stood up straighter. The stoop in my shoulders disappeared. "Do it, Reverend," I said. My voice didn't sound like an old man's voice anymore. It sounded like steel. But the children... He hesitated, looking around the empty cemetery. "They aren't coming," I said, and I made sure my voice carried over the sound of the rain so the few witnesses under the tent could hear me clearly. "My children are busy." I walked over to the pile of dirt next to the grave. I didn't use the little silver shovel they provide for these ceremonies. I reached down and grabbed a handful of the wet, heavy mud with my bare hand. I wanted to feel it. I wanted to remember this moment. I squeezed the dirt until my knuckles turned white. I thought about the lie Brandon told me this morning. I thought about the smile on Stephanie's face in that photo. I thought about the $1 million they were celebrating. They think the money is theirs. They think I am weak. They think I am just a signature on a check. I tossed the dirt onto the casket. The sound was a dull, final thud. It was the sound of a door closing. "Goodbye, my love," I whispered. "I promise you, I will finish raising them. It seems you and I left the job undone. But I will fix it." I turned away from the grave and walked back to my car. I didn't look back. I took out my handkerchief and wiped the mud from my hands, cleaning every speck of dirt from under my fingernails. I needed to be clean. I needed to be precise. I sat in the driver's seat of my 10-year-old sedan. and looked at the dashboard. My phone buzzed again. Another notification. Stephanie had deleted the photo. She probably realized how bad it looked, or maybe Brandon told her to take it down before I saw it. Too late, sweetheart. The auditor has already seen the evidence. I started the engine. I wasn't going to awake. I wasn't going to cry in my pillow. I was going home. And I knew exactly what I would find there. They would be waiting for me not with hugs, but with demands. I pulled the car out of the cemetery gates. The windshield wipers slashed back and forth like a metronome counting down the time. They wanted $1 million. I was going to give them something else entirely. The drive from the cemetery to the house usually takes 15 minutes, but I drove slowly, letting the line of cars behind me build up without a care. I needed the time to compose my face. I needed to lock away the heartbroken husband and bring out the forensic auditor. I shifted gears, feeling the vibration of the old engine in my hands. This car had carried Catherine to chemotherapy sessions, to grocery runs to the beach on that one weekend we finally took for ourselves. Now it was carrying me to a crime scene. I turned the corner onto Elm Street and felt a physical jolt in my stomach. The garage door was gaping wide open, exposing the clutter of tools and gardening supplies Catherine had organized just last fall. But that wasn't what made my grip tighten on the steering wheel. It was the car. A silver Porsche 911 was parked haphazardly across the front lawn. It wasn't in the driveway. It was right on the grass. The dormant winter-brown grass that Catherine had spent years tending to with her own hands. She used to weed that lawn manually, refusing to use harsh chemicals because she wanted the robins to be safe. Now deep muddy tire tracks gouged through the soil, tearing up the turf like scars. I recognized the car. It wasn't owned, of course. Brandon leased his life. He leased his cars, he leased his condo. He probably leased his personality. He wanted the neighbors to see a Porsche in the driveway, even if he couldn't afford the gas to run it. I pulled my sedan into the driveway, blocking them in. I turned off the ignition and sat there for a moment, listening to the silence of the car, breathing in the scent of old leather and rain. Then I opened the door. The front door of the house was unlocked. In fact, it was wide open. A cold draft was sucking the warmth out of the hallway, carrying with it the damp smell of the storm. But as I stepped across the threshold, another smell hit me. It was the cloying sweet scent of expensive perfume mixed with the sharp tang of scotch. I looked down at the floor. The hardwood, which I had polished just last week in anticipation of the wake that never happened, was streaked with mud. Heavy, careless footprints tracked from the door, weaving through the living room and heading straight toward the back of the house. They hadn't even wiped their feet. I didn't call out. I didn't announce my arrival. I followed the mud. The living room was a wreck. Cushions were thrown on the floor. The drawers of the sideboard where Catherine kept the good silverware and her collection of linen napkins were pulled out, their contents spilling over the edges. It looked like a police raid or a looting, but the noise was coming from down the hall. The sound of metal grinding against metal. A harsh, screeching noise that set my teeth on edge. I walked past the master bedroom. The door was ajar. I glanced inside and saw a flash of movement in the mirror. Stephanie was standing there. She was holding up one of Catherine's vintage pearl necklaces, draping it against her black cocktail dress. Beside her, Tiffany, my daughter-in-law, was rummaging through the jewelry box on the vanity. Slipping rings onto her fingers, holding her hand up to the light to catch the sparkle. They were shopping. They were picking through the bones before the body was even cold. I kept walking. The grinding noise grew louder. It was coming from my study. I stopped in the doorway. The scene before me would have broken a weaker man, but it just calcified the resolve in my chest. Brandon had his back to me. He had taken off his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves. He was sweating, his shirt clinging to his back. In his hands was a crowbar, likely taken from my own garage. He was jamming the curved end into the gap of my mahogany filing cabinet, heaving with his entire body weight. Jason, my son-in-law, was standing next to him, holding a flashlight with shaking hands, his eyes darting around the room nervously. Heave, crunch. The wood splintered. This wasn't just a cabinet. This was an antique I had bought when I started my own firm 30 years ago. Brandon grunted with exertion. "Come on, you piece of junk, give it up." He pulled again, and the lock snapped with a loud crack. The drawer flew open, spilling files onto the floor. I cleared my throat. The sound was soft, but in that room it sounded like a gunshot. Jason jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight. Brandon froze the crowbar still in his hand. He turned around slowly. He didn't look guilty. He didn't look ashamed. He looked annoyed, as if I were the intruder. Finally, Brandon said, exhaling a breath that smelled of my best single malt scotch. "You are back. Where is the key, Dad? We have been looking everywhere. This thing is ancient." He tossed the crowbar onto my desk. It landed with a heavy thud, scratching the leather surface. I looked at the crowbar. I looked at the splintered wood of the cabinet. I looked at the files scattered on the floor, tax returns, medical records, old birthday cards. "Hello to you too, Brandon," I said, my voice level. "We don't have time for pleasantries," he snapped, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "We need the trust fund documents. Lawyer Whitman said the trust activates immediately upon interment." "Well, she is interred, isn't she? We need the access codes and the ledger. Now." I looked at Jason. He refused to meet my eyes, focusing intently on a spot on the carpet. "You missed the funeral," I said. It wasn't a question. Brandon waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "We tried, Dad. Traffic was a nightmare. And honestly, it was too much. The stress, the grief. We couldn't handle seeing her like that." Steps clicked behind me. Stephanie and Tiffany appeared in the doorway. Stephanie was still wearing the pearls. She hadn't even bothered to take them off. "Daddy," Stephanie said, her voice dropping into a register that was supposed to sound soothing, but sounded patronizing. "You look terrible. You are soaking wet." I looked at her. "Where were you, Stephanie?" Tiffany stepped forward, then placing a manicured hand on my damp shoulder. Her eyes were wide and glistening with what looked like tears, but I knew better. I know the difference between tears of sorrow and tears of performance. "Oh, Harrison, don't be unreasonable," she said, her voice trembling, just the right amount. The children were devastated. We were all huddled together at the house, crying our eyes out. We poured a drink to calm our nerves, and we lost track of time. You have to understand, young people process grief differently. We couldn't bear the finality of the grave. It was out of love, really. We wanted to remember her alive. I looked at her. Then I looked at Brandon, who was checking his watch. I looked at the mud on the floor. Gaslighting. It is a technique liars use to make you question your own reality. She was trying to tell me that their champagne toast on a balcony 15 miles away was an act of grief. She was trying to tell me that breaking into my office with a crowbar was an act of love. They thought I was senile. They thought I would buy it because I was old and lonely and desperate for their affection. I didn't say a word. I walked past Brandon, stepping over the pile of files he had dumped on the floor. I moved toward my desk. There, lying face down on the Persian rug, was a silver frame. It was the photo from our wedding day. Catherine and I laughing, cutting the cake. I bent down. My joints protested, aching from the cold rain, but I didn't wince. I reached out and picked up the frame. The glass wasn't broken miraculously, but there, right across Catherine's white dress, was a smear of mud, a tread mark from a heavy, expensive sneaker. Brandon's sneaker. I pulled a tissue from the box on my desk and slowly, methodically wiped the mud from the glass. I cleaned her face. I cleaned my face. I set the photo back on the desk, positioning it exactly where it belonged. The room was silent. They were watching me, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to sign, waiting for me to hand over the keys to the kingdom. I turned to face them. I didn't shout. I didn't scream. I didn't tell them about the Instagram photo. Not yet. You want to open the safe? I asked. Yes, Brandon said, stepping forward eager. The papers are in there, right? We need to secure the assets. For the family. I looked at the heavy steel safe in the corner of the room. It contained everything. The deeds, the bonds, the access, keys to the trust. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold metal of my keyring. Fine, I said. The tension in the room snapped. I saw Jason's shoulders relax. I saw a smirk touch the corner of Stephanie's mouth. They thought they had won. They thought the old man had folded. Tomorrow, I said. Brandon's face fell. What? No, Dad, we need it now. It is Friday. The banks close at 5. We have things to arrange. I walked to the door of the office, holding it open. I am tired, I said. I just buried my wife. I am going to take a shower and I am going to rest. If you want to talk business, come back tomorrow morning. But Dad, Stephanie started to whine. Get out, I said. I didn't say it loudly, but the tone stopped her dead. It was the voice I used when I had caught a CFO embezzling funds and gave him one chance to confess before I called the feds. Get out of my office. Get out of my house. Take your rental car off my wife's lawn. Come back at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Or don't come back at all. Brandon glared at me, his jaw working. He looked at the safe, then at the crowbar, then at me. He weighed his options. He realized he couldn't physically force me, not without crossing a line he wasn't quite ready to cross yet. Fine, he spat. Tomorrow. But have the papers ready. We aren't playing games, Dad. He stormed out, bumping my shoulder as he passed. Jason scurried after him like a frightened rat. Stephanie and Tiffany exchanged a look of pure venom before following them, their high heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. I watched them go. I watched them pile into the silver Porsche. I watched them back out over the curb, tearing up more grass as they sped away. I closed the front door and locked it. I engaged the deadbolt. Then I slid the chain across. I was alone in the silent house. The smell of their perfume lingered, tainting the air. I wasn't going to sleep. I wasn't going to rest. I walked back into my office and picked up the phone. I dialed a number I hadn't called in years, but one I knew by heart. It was the private line of Arthur Whitman, our family attorney. I needed to know exactly what kind of trap Catherine had left for them, and then I needed to set a few traps of my own. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the front door, not because I had forgiven them, but because 40 years of auditing had taught me that you cannot dismantle a fraudulent scheme until you see the paperwork. My children were standing on the porch, shivering slightly in the damp night air, clutching leather portfolios like shields. When I motioned them inside, they didn't apologize for the earlier break-in attempt or the scene in the office. They simply marched into the living room as if they were board members arriving for a hostile takeover. Their earlier aggression replaced by a slick, desperate professionalism that was almost more insulting. The atmosphere in the living room was suffocating. I sat in my armchair, the leather cold against my back, while they arranged themselves on the sofa opposite me. Brandon took the lead, placing a thick, glossy document on the coffee table with a heavy thud. It wasn't just a contract. It was a presentation. I looked at the cover. The words Lakeview Estate were printed in embossed gold foil. Below it was an architectural rendering of a sprawling mansion that looked more like a hotel than a home. It had turrets, a 4-car garage, and an infinity pool that spilled over toward a digital lake. It was excessive. It was gaudy. It was everything Catherine detested. We have a solution, Dad, Brandon said, his voice smooth, practicing the pitch he likely used on his high-end clients. We know things got heated earlier. We apologize. Emotions are high. But we need to be practical. Mom left the trust fund for the family's future, and we have found the perfect investment to secure that legacy. He flipped the document open to a page filled with numbers. I didn't need my reading glasses to see the bottom line. $2.5 million. I looked up at him. You want to buy a house for $2.5 million. You don't have $2.5 million, Brandon. That is where the trust comes in. Stephanie interjected, leaning forward. Her mascara was smudged, giving her a manic look. We have the financing lined up for the mortgage, Daddy. Brandon has a lender ready to go. But we need the down payment. A substantial one to get the prime interest rate. Tiffany. My daughter-in-law pointed a manicured finger at a line item highlighted in yellow. $1 million. Exactly the amount in Catherine's trust. We need you to sign the release, Brandon said, tapping the paper. We need the funds transferred to the escrow account by Friday at 5 p.m. That is 48 hours from now. I looked at the timeline. It was incredibly tight for a real estate transaction of this size. Why the rush? I asked, keeping my face neutral. Houses like this stay on the market for months. It is a competitive market, Brandon lied. His eyes didn't blink, a sure sign of a rehearsed speech. We have a bidding war. If we don't put the earnest money down by Friday close of business, we lose the deal. And how much is the earnest money? I asked. There was a pause, a beat of silence that told me everything. $100,000, Jason spoke up from the corner of the sofa. It was the first time my son-in-law had spoken since they returned. His voice was thin and reedy. We already put it down. We borrowed against some assets to secure the hold. If we don't close the funding by Friday, we forfeit the deposit. I looked at Jason. Really looked at him. While Brandon and Stephanie were projecting an image of confident success, Jason was vibrating with terror. He was holding a glass of water, and the surface of the liquid was rippling because his hand was shaking so violently. Sweat beaded on his upper lip despite the cool temperature of the house. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the clock on the mantel, watching the second hand sweep around. $100,000 non-refundable deposit on a 48-hour timeline. No legitimate bank operates like that. That wasn't a standard real estate contract term. That was a shark's term. That was hard money. They had borrowed $100,000 from someone dangerous to lock in this deal, betting everything on the fact that I would hand over Catherine's $1 million to cover them. Why this house? I asked quietly. Why now? Your mother hasn't been in the ground for 6 hours. Stephanie let out a sob that sounded practiced. That is exactly why, Daddy. Mom always wanted us to be close. She hated that we lived in different parts of the city. She always talked about a family compound, a place where the grandchildren could run around and we could all be together under one roof. This house has a guest wing. It has space for everyone. It is her dream, Daddy. We are doing this for her. It is her dying wish. I felt a surge of bile rise in my throat. I remembered Catherine sitting at this very coffee table cutting coupons from the Sunday paper, even though we had plenty of money in the bank. I remembered her refusing to buy a new winter coat because the old one still had good buttons. Catherine hated debt. She hated ostentation. The idea of her children living in a mortgaged monstrosity, drowning in payments they couldn't afford, would have broken her heart. She never said that I said. She did, Tiffany insisted, placing her hand over her heart. She told me last Christmas. She said, I wish I could buy a castle for my babies. They were rewriting history. They were using the silence of the dead to validate their greed. It was the lowest form of manipulation I had ever witnessed, and I had interviewed corporate fraudsters who stole from orphans. I looked back at the contract. My eyes scanned the fine print at the bottom of the page. The seller was listed as a limited liability company, an LLC with a vague name, Obsidian Holdings. I memorized it instantly. I looked at Jason again. He was tapping his foot on the floor, a rapid staccato rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. He looked like a man waiting for a bomb to go off. If this was just about buying a dream home, he would be excited. He would be showing me pictures of the pool or the kitchen. But he wasn't. He was terrified. This wasn't an investment. This was a rescue mission. They were in trouble, deep trouble, and they viewed Catherine's life savings as their bail money. I knew that if I said no right now, if I kicked them out again, the situation would explode. Desperate people do dangerous things. If Jason owed money to the wrong people, and I shut the door on him tonight, they might come back with more than just a crowbar. I needed time. I needed to see the full picture. I needed to trace the LLC. I needed to talk to Whitman. I let out a long, heavy sigh. I slumped my shoulders, allowing the fatigue I truly felt to take over my posture. I took off my glasses and rubbed the bridge of my nose, mimicking the gesture of a defeated old man. "It is a lot of money," I mumbled, my voice wavering. "It is an investment," Brandon urged, sensing blood in the water. "Property values in that area are skyrocketing. The trust will double in value in 5 years. Mom would want us to be secure." I put my glasses back on and looked at them. I made sure my eyes looked watery and tired, not sharp and calculating. "I don't understand all these numbers," I said, pushing the contract away slightly. "It has been a long day. My head is spinning. I can't sign anything tonight. My hand is shaking too much." Brandon's face tightened. "Dad, we told you the deadline." I know, Friday," I interrupted, raising a weak hand. "That gives us tomorrow. I need to sleep. I need to pray on it. And I need to have Arthur Whitman look at the transfer papers. I can't just write a check. The trust has rules." Stephanie looked at Brandon. Panic flared in her eyes. "Can't we just bypass the lawyer? Can't you just use your power as the executor?" I shook my head slowly. "No, sweetheart. Arthur has the seals. He has the final authorization codes. If I try to move that much money without him, the bank will freeze the account for fraud. You don't want that, do you?" Jason flinched at the word freeze. "Fine," Brandon said, exhaling sharply. "Fine. We will go to Whitman's office first thing in the morning. 9 a.m. sharp. You meet us there." I nodded. "Yes. 9 a.m. I will be there." Brandon stood up, buttoning his jacket. He looked relieved, smug. He thought he had maneuvered me. He thought the delay was just an old man's hesitation, not a tactical retreat. "You are making the right choice, Dad," he said, patting my shoulder with a condescension that made my skin crawl. "Mom would be proud of you." They gathered their papers. Stephanie lingered for a second, looking at the pearl necklace she was still wearing, then at me, daring me to ask for it back. I didn't. I let her keep it. It was evidence now. "We will see you tomorrow," Harris and Tiffany said, offering a fake, tight smile. "Get some rest. You look awful." They filed out of the house, the energy in the room shifting from confrontation to premature celebration. I heard them in the driveway. "We got him," I heard Brandon whisper loudly. "He is folding." "Close one," Jason muttered. I waited until the taillights of the Porsche disappeared down the street. I waited until the silence of the empty house returned heavy and mournful. Then I stood up. I walked to the kitchen and poured the glass of water Jason had left untouched into the sink. I washed the glass. I dried it. They thought they had until Friday. They thought they were 48 hours away from $1 million. They were wrong. They were 12 hours away from the most thorough audit of their lives. I went back to my office, stepped over the broken wood of the cabinet, and sat down at my computer. I pulled a small encrypted USB drive from my safe, the real safe, the one hidden behind the baseboard that they hadn't found. It was time to go to work. I had an LLC to investigate, and I had a feeling that Obsidian Holdings was going to lead me straight to the truth they were trying to bury. I turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the master bedroom into a heavy, suffocating darkness. To anyone watching from the street, the Caldwell house was asleep, a mourning home finally resting after a day of sorrow. But I was not asleep. I was sitting on the edge of the mattress, my feet pressing against the cold hardwood floor, listening. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm, the kind of controlled pulse I used to maintain during high-stakes audits when I knew a suspect was lying to my face. I waited for 10 minutes, then 20. The silence of the house was broken only by the settling of the foundation and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Then I heard it. The clink of glass against glass. A soft, wet sound of liquid being poured. It was coming from the living room. They hadn't left. Or at least the boys hadn't. I stood up. I didn't put on my slippers. I needed to be silent and slippers shuffle. I walked barefoot, navigating the room by memory. I knew every creaky floorboard in this hallway. Catherine used to joke that I could float through the house like a ghost when I wanted a midnight snack without waking her. Now I needed to be a ghost for a different reason. I cracked the bedroom door open just an inch. A sliver of amber light sliced across the floor. They had turned on the reading lamp by the armchair, the one Catherine used for her knitting. I moved into the hallway, sticking close to the wall where the floor joists were strongest and least likely to groan under my weight. I stopped just before the archway leading to the living room. I couldn't see them, but I could smell them. The rich, peaty aroma of my 18-year-old single malt scotch drifted toward me. That bottle was a retirement gift. I had been saving it for a special occasion. Apparently, my wife's funeral was the occasion they chose. Jason's voice cut through the air, high-pitched and vibrating with panic. "You saw his face, Brandon. He is hesitating. If he doesn't sign by Friday, I am dead. Literally dead." There was the sound of ice swirling in a glass. Brandon let out a low, dismissive chuckle. "Relax, Jay. You are being dramatic. He isn't hesitating. He is just old. His brain is firing on half cylinders. Did you see how he looked at the contract? He was squinting like he was trying to read hieroglyphics. He is confused. He is tired. He will sign because it is the path of least resistance." "I am not being dramatic, Jason," hissed, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "These aren't bank collectors, Brandon. These are the guys who operate out of the back of the pool hall on 4th Street. I owe them 80 grand plus interest. They told me if I don't have the cash by 5 p.m. Friday, they aren't going to take my car. They are going to take my hand. My right hand." I held my breath, pressing my back against the wallpaper. Loan sharks. My son-in-law, the man raising my grandchildren, was gambling with violent criminals. That explained the shaking hands. That explained the desperate timeline. He wasn't buying a house. He was buying his life. "Drink your scotch," Brandon said, his voice smooth and cold. "It is good stuff. The old man has good taste, I will give him that. Look, even if he reads the contract, he won't understand the shell company. I buried the ownership structure 3 layers deep. As far as he knows, Obsidian Holdings is just a developer. He doesn't know it is me." My blood ran cold. Brandon wasn't just helping Jason. He was the seller. He was selling a property he likely owned or controlled to the family trust at an inflated price. They were conspiring to wash the money right under my nose. But what if he talks to Whitman? "Jason," asked, the glass clinking against his teeth as he took a nervous sip. "Whitman isn't senile. Whitman is a paper pusher," Brandon scoffed. "And as for Dad, don't worry about his mental state. I made sure he wouldn't be asking too many sharp questions this week." "What do you mean?" Jason asked. Brandon laughed again, a cruel, ugly sound. "You know his blood pressure medication, the little white pills he takes every morning like clockwork?" "Yeah. Well, let's just say he is getting a very healthy dose of vitamin D instead. I swapped them out on Tuesday when I came over to help Mom with the garage. He has been popping sugar pills and vitamins for 3 days. His pressure is probably through the roof. It makes him foggy, tired, dizzy. He can't focus on details. By tomorrow morning, he will be so out of it, he will sign the Declaration of Independence if I put it in front of him, just to go back to bed." The hallway seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I had to reach out and grip the doorframe to keep from falling. They weren't just thieves. They weren't just liars. They were killing me. High blood pressure runs in my family. It is what killed my father. It is what put me in the hospital 5 years ago. Without that medication, a spike in stress could trigger a stroke or a heart attack at any moment. Brandon knew that. He knew my medical history better than anyone. He was weaponizing my own body against me to steal $1 million. He wasn't just banking on me being old. He was manufacturing my decline. I listened for another moment, but I had heard enough. I heard the clink of the bottle against the glass again. They were refilling. They were celebrating their cleverness while sipping the liquor of the man they were actively poisoning. I backed away slowly, step by careful step, until I was safely inside the master bedroom. I closed the door silently, the latch clicking into place like the hammer of a gun. My hands were shaking, but this time it wasn't from grief or age. It was from a rage so pure, so hot, it felt like it was burning the lining of my stomach. I walked to the nightstand. My prescription bottles were lined up in a neat row just as Catherine had organized them. I picked up the bottle labeled Lisinopril. I opened the cap and poured the contents into my palm. I stared at them in the dim moonlight, filtering through the window. They were small, round, and white. They looked exactly like my medication, but I looked closer. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and shone it on the pills in my hand. My real medication had a tiny imprint on one side, a code number. These pills were smooth. They were slightly chalky. Vitamins. Cheap, generic vitamins. I felt a wave of dizziness that had nothing to do with blood pressure. My own son. The boy I taught to ride a bike. The boy I sat with through night terrors. He had stood in my bathroom, emptied my life-saving medicine, and replaced it with decoys knowing it could kill me. He didn't care if I died. In fact, if I died after signing the papers, it would just simplify things for him. No more old man to visit. No more questions. Just the money. I walked into the ensuite bathroom. I didn't turn on the light. I moved by the pale glow of the street lamp outside. I stood over the toilet and opened my hand. The pills fell into the water with tiny, insignificant splashes. I flushed. I watched the water swirl, taking the evidence of his betrayal down the drain. I opened the medicine cabinet. Behind a box of old bandages hidden in the back where I kept travel supplies was an emergency stash of my real medication. I kept it there in case I ever ran out on a weekend. Brandon didn't know about the stash. He wasn't thorough. He was arrogant. I took a real pill and swallowed it dry. It tasted bitter like justice. Then I leaned over the sink and looked at myself in the mirror. The face staring back at me was old. The skin was wrinkled, the eyes were tired, the hair was thinning. It was the face of a grieving widower. It was the face of a victim. But as I watched, something changed in the eyes. The watery sadness evaporated. The confusion vanished. The pupils constricted, sharp and focused. They wanted a senile old man. They wanted a foggy, confused father who would sign away his legacy to save them from their own sins. I gripped the edge of the porcelain sink until my knuckles turned white. I am not that man, I whispered to the reflection. I am Harrison Caldwell. I brought down the Enron subsidiaries. I traced assets through 3 continents to catch a Ponzi schemer. I have stared down cartel accountants and corrupt senators. And I am going to destroy you. I splashed cold water on my face and dried it with a rough towel. I walked back into the bedroom and sat in the leather chair by the window, watching the rain streak against the glass. Let them drink my scotch. Let them think they have won. Let them believe the old man is fading away. Tomorrow I wouldn't just be going to the lawyer. I would be going to war. And unlike them, I wouldn't be fighting with borrowed money or fake pills. I would be fighting with the truth. And the truth, as they were about to find out, is the deadliest weapon of all. I arrived at the law offices of Whitman Stone and Associates at 7:45 in the morning. The building was a brick fortress downtown, the kind of place that charged $500 just to open the front door. The receptionist hadn't even arrived yet, but I knew Arthur Whitman would be there. Arthur was like me. He believed that the world belonged to those who showed up before the coffee was brewed. I found the side door unlocked, just as it had been for 30 years of our friendship. I walked down the plush carpeted hallway, the silence of the firm offering a stark contrast to the chaos inside my own head. Arthur was in his corner office staring out the window at the gray morning sky. He turned when I entered, his face lined with the same grief I felt, but layered with a specific kind of anxiety. "Harrison," he said, removing his reading glasses, "you are early. The appointment with the children isn't until 9. I didn't sit down. I walked straight to his desk, placing my hands flat on the polished wood. I needed to establish control immediately. "I know about the pills, Arthur." He blinked, confused. "What pills?" "My son swapped my blood pressure medication for vitamins," I said, my voice low and steady. "He is trying to induce a medical event to force me to sign the release. They are desperate, Arthur. They owe money to people who break legs for a living." Arthur's face went pale. He sank into his leather chair, looking suddenly very old. "Dear God, I knew they were entitled, Harrison, but I never thought—" I cut him off. "We don't have time for shock. I need to see the trust documents. Not the summary you sent over last week. I need the master file. The original instrument Catherine signed 6 months ago." Arthur hesitated. He looked at the locked drawer on his right, then back at me. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Reluctance, no, it was protection. "There is something you don't know," he said softly. "Something Catherine asked me not to tell you unless it was absolutely necessary." "It is necessary," I said. "Show me." Arthur unlocked the drawer. He pulled out a heavy-bound document with a blue cover. He didn't hand it to me immediately. He held it, his fingers tracing the gold lettering on the front. "6 months ago, Catherine came here alone," he began. "She didn't drive herself. She took a taxi because she didn't want you to know. She brought a stack of papers with her. Bank statements, credit card bills she had intercepted from Brandon's mailbox." I felt a chill run down my spine. Catherine never snooped. She trusted blindly. Or so I thought. She knew, Arthur continued. She knew Brandon was running a Ponzi scheme. She saw the transfers from his client accounts into his personal offshore holdings. She didn't understand the technicalities, Harrison, but she knew math. She knew the numbers didn't add up. She knew he was stealing to fund that lifestyle of his. I stared at the blue folder. My wife, the woman who knit sweaters and baked cookies, had conducted her own investigation. She had protected me from the truth because she knew it would break my heart. "And Stephanie?" I asked. "She knew about the debt," Arthur nodded. "She knew Stephanie had maxed out 7 credit cards and taken out a second mortgage on her condo to pay for that influencer lifestyle. Catherine was terrified, Harrison. Not for herself, for you. She was terrified that when she died, they would bleed you dry. She said you were too soft with them, that you would give them anything they asked for out of grief." I closed my eyes. She was right. Until yesterday, she was absolutely right. "So she changed the terms," Arthur said, sliding the folder across the desk. "Open it to page 42. Subsection C." I opened the document. The paper was thick, creamy, expensive. I turned the pages until I found it. The clause was bolded. The Supreme Guardian Clause. I read the legal jargon, my auditor's brain translating it instantly into plain English. It was a masterpiece of estate planning. It stated that while the children were the named beneficiaries, the surviving spouse, me, was appointed as the supreme guardian of the assets. It gave me absolute unilateral veto power. It meant that the money didn't transfer automatically. It meant I had to affirmatively certify that the beneficiaries were of sound moral and financial standing. If I determined they were not, if I found evidence of fiscal irresponsibility or criminal activity, I had the legal right to dissolve their claim entirely. But it went further. The clause gave me the power to redirect the entirety of the corpus, the full $1 million, to a designated charitable remainder trust. I looked up at Arthur. "Does Brandon know about this?" "No," Arthur said. "Catherine insisted we keep this sealed. She wanted to give them a chance. She hoped they would step up, but she prepared for the worst. She left you the gun, Harrison. She just hoped you would never have to pull the trigger." I ran my finger over Catherine's signature at the bottom of the page. It was shaky, the cancer was already affecting her motor skills, but it was determined. Even on her deathbed, she was fighting for us. She was protecting our legacy from the very children she birthed. I looked at the clock on the wall. 8:15. They would be here in 45 minutes. "I need you to do something for me, Arthur," I said, closing the folder. "Anything. I need you to draft 2 sets of documents for the meeting." "2?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes. The first set will be the standard release forms, the ones Brandon thinks he is signing, the ones that transfer the $1 million directly to the escrow account for that ridiculous house. Make them look official. Use the gold seals. Make them look like victory." "And the second set?" Arthur asked slowly. "The second set invokes the Supreme Guardian Clause," I said. "It declares Brandon and Stephanie unfit beneficiaries due to financial malfeasance and criminal intent. It triggers the immediate transfer of all funds to the Catherine Caldwell Legal Aid Fund for elderly abuse victims." Arthur stared at me. His mouth opened slightly. "Harrison, if you do that, if you spring that on them, they will be blindsided," I finished. "Yes. That is the point. But the fallout," Arthur warned. "They will sue. They will scream. It will be a war. It is already a war, Arthur," I said, my voice hardening. "They fired the first shot when they tried to kill me with vitamin pills. I am just finishing it." I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street where the city was waking up. I saw a silver Porsche turning the corner, aggressive and fast. They were early. Of course they were early. Greed doesn't sleep in. "Prepare the room, Arthur," I said, turning back to him. "Put the fake papers on the table. Let them think they have won. I want to see their faces. I want to see the moment they think they are rich." Arthur nodded, reaching for his intercom to call his paralegal. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and admiration. "You are going to destroy them, Harrison," he whispered. I shook my head. "No, Arthur. I am going to save them. They are drowning in a sea of their own making, and they think money is a life raft. It isn't. It's an anchor. I am going to cut the rope. It might hurt, but it is the only way they will learn to swim." I sat down in the client chair facing the door. I crossed my legs. I composed my face into the mask of the tired, grieving, confused old man they expected to see. Let them come, I thought. The Supreme Guardian is ready. I pulled into the driveway and waited for the garage door to close behind me before I let out the breath I had been holding since leaving Whitman's office. The house was quiet, disturbingly so. The silver Porsche was gone, which meant they were out probably at the high-end mall in Stamford, maxing out credit cards they assumed I would pay off by the weekend. They were celebrating a victory they hadn't yet won. I walked into the kitchen. The smell of stale coffee and expensive cologne hung in the air. On the granite island sitting right next to a half-eaten bagel was a laptop. It was Jason's. I recognized the stickers on the lid logos of cryptocurrency exchanges and trading platforms, the badges of a man who thought he was smarter than the market. He had been so eager to leave, so desperate to get to the champagne that he had made the cardinal sin of any criminal enterprise. He left the ledger behind. I didn't try to guess his password. I didn't need to. I went to my study and opened the false bottom of my desk drawer. Inside, wrapped in an anti-static bag, was a small nondescript USB drive. It looked like a chapstick you would get at a trade show, but it contained a portable forensic operating system I used during my consulting days. It was designed to bypass local security protocols and mount the hard drive as a read-only device. It was a skeleton key for the digital world. I returned to the kitchen, pulled a chair up to the island, and plugged the drive into the side of the laptop. I held down the boot key and waited. The screen flickered, bypassing the smiling Windows login prompt, and loaded a stark black terminal with lines of white code scrolling faster than the eye could follow. I was in. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I wasn't Harrison the grieving father anymore. I was Harrison the auditor. I wasn't looking for sentiment. I was looking for patterns. I was looking for the money. First, I went for the email archives. I searched for Obsidian Holdings, the LLC listed as the seller on that ridiculous real estate contract. The search returned 42 hits. I opened the most recent attachment. It wasn't a deed. It was an internal memo from Brandon's real estate firm. The subject line read, "Distressed Asset Liquidation, Lakeview Property." I read the document, and the audacity of the scheme made my stomach churn. The Lakeview house wasn't a dream home. It was a nightmare. It was a toxic asset Brandon's firm had acquired in a foreclosure 2 years ago. It had structural issues, mold in the foundation, and a lien against it that exceeded its market value. They had been trying to offload it for 18 months with 0 takers. Then I found the email from Brandon to his boss. "Don't worry about the Lakeview write-off," Brandon had written 3 days ago. "I have a private buyer lined up, full asking price, cash. We can close by Friday." He was using his mother's death to bail out his professional failure. He was going to take $1 million from the trust, buy this lemon of a house from his own company, to look like a hero to his boss, and saddle the family with a property that was essentially worthless. He wasn't building a legacy. He was laundering his reputation. I saved the emails to my secure drive and moved on. I needed to understand Jason's panic. I opened his browser history and navigated to his trading accounts. The forensic software allowed me to view the cached pages without logging in or alerting the bank's security systems. The numbers on the screen were a sea of red. Jason wasn't just a bad trader. He was a catastrophic one. He had been trading options, betting on market volatility that never happened. I scrolled through the transaction history. He had leveraged everything. The mortgage on their current house, their cars, even the kids' college funds. And then I saw it. The bottom line. Negative $512,000. He had received a margin call 4 days ago. The brokerage was demanding immediate liquidity. But that wasn't the worst part. I found a folder labeled Private. Inside were scanned images of promissory notes. They weren't from a bank. They were handwritten, signed with shaky signatures, lending terms that were illegal in 49 states. He had borrowed from loan sharks to cover the margin call, hoping to win it back before anyone noticed. He lost that too. Now the sharks were circling. The $100,000 earnest money they put down on the house, that was the last of it. It was a Hail Mary pass. If I didn't sign the trust release, Jason wouldn't just be broke. He would be hunted. I felt a cold detachment settle over me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just cataloging the damage. Then I opened the messaging app. It synced with his phone's backup. I found a group chat named The Inner Circle. It included Jason, Brandon, Stephanie, and Tiffany. I scrolled back to the day of the funeral. "God, this rain is awful," Stephanie had typed at 2:15 p.m. right when the casket was being lowered. "My hair is going to frizz. Can we just skip the cemetery?" "The old man won't notice. He is in a trance." "Agreed," Brandon replied. "Let's go straight to the house. We need to find that key before he gets back. The sooner we get the money, the sooner we can stop pretending to care about this dusty old antique furniture." "He looked pathetic this morning," Tiffany added, "all weepy and trembling. It is embarrassing. Honestly, he needs to just sign the papers and go to a home. He is useless space now. And then the message that stopped my heart. It was from Brandon, time-stamped just last night after I had kicked them out of the office. Don't worry about his hesitation. The vitamins will kick in by tomorrow. His BP will be through the roof. He will be too dizzy to read the fine print. Honestly, if the old man stroked out and died this weekend, it would be a blessing. It would save us the hassle of pretending to be filial for another 10 years. Quick probate cash out done. I stared at the words. Ideally, he dies. My son. My firstborn. The boy I held when he had a fever of 104, wishing I could take the pain for him. He was calculating the convenience of my death. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the USB drive, and initiated the full extraction. I copied everything. The emails, the bank statements, the loan shark notes, the text messages. Every byte of their betrayal was now mine. The progress bar crawled across the screen. 80%. 90%. Then I heard the rumble of an engine outside. The Porsche. They were back. I looked at the screen. 98%. The car door slammed. I heard Stephanie's high-pitched laugh, manic and loud. They were drunk. They were celebrating the money they thought they had already won. 99%. I heard the key turn in the front lock. Complete. I yanked the USB drive out of the port. The screen flickered back to the login prompt. I wiped the keyboard with my handkerchief to remove any prints or oil from my fingers. I closed the laptop lid, positioning it exactly as it had been slightly askew next to the bagel. I stood up, my knees popping. I slipped the USB drive into my sock, tucking it deep against my ankle. The front door opened. Dad. We brought takeout, Brandon shouted, his voice booming with false cheer. I didn't have time to get to my bedroom. I shuffled quickly to the living room sofa and collapsed onto it. I let my mouth hang open slightly. I allowed my glasses to slide down my nose. I closed my eyes and slowed my breathing, mimicking the shallow, rattling breath of an exhausted old man. Check the kitchen, Brandon said. I left my computer. I hope he didn't touch it, Jason said, his voice laced with panic. Relax, Brandon scoffed. He probably doesn't even know how to turn it on. He still uses a flip phone, for Christ's sake. Footsteps approached the living room. I felt a shadow fall over me. I twitched slightly, adding a small snore for effect. Look at him, Stephanie whispered. He is out cold. God, he looks ancient. Good, Brandon said, his voice coming from the kitchen doorway. A tired mind is a compliant mind. Let him sleep. We need him fresh for the signing ceremony tonight. I want that signature before the ink dries on the check. They walked past me, heading for the dining room, the smell of greasy food trailing behind them. I kept my eyes closed, listening to the clatter of containers and the pop of another cork. Sleep well, children, I thought. Enjoy your meal, because tomorrow you are going to choke on it. I woke to the sound of laughter and the heavy crinkling noise of stiff paper bags hitting the floor. It was a jarring sound in a house that should have been silent with mourning. I kept my eyes closed for a moment longer, regulating my breathing, reminding myself of the role I had to play. I was no longer the sharp auditor who had just cracked their digital lives open like an oyster. I was Harrison, the frail Harrison, the confused Harrison, the obstacle that was finally crumbling. I opened my eyes, slowly blinking against the harsh overhead lights they had turned on. Brandon and Stephanie were standing in the center of the living room, surrounded by an obscene amount of luxury. There were orange Hermes boxes stacked on the coffee table right on top of a coaster. There were black Chanel bags and distinctive green Rolex shopping totes. They looked like they had looted a high-end mall. They were still wearing their funeral clothes, but they had accessorized their grief with greed. Stephanie was already draping a new cashmere shawl over her shoulders, admiring the way it fell. Brandon was strapping a chunky gold watch onto his wrist, the metal glinting under the chandelier. "Well, look who is awake," Brandon said, his voice loud and booming. He didn't look tired anymore. The adrenaline of spending money he didn't have was coursing through his veins. "How was your nap, Dad? You were out cold." I sat up slowly, letting out a groan that wasn't entirely fake. My back actually did hurt from the sofa, but I amplified the stiffness. I rubbed my eyes with the heel of my hand, making sure my movements were uncoordinated and sluggish. I must have drifted off," I stammered, letting my voice crack. "What time is it?" "It is late," Tiffany said, stepping out from the kitchen with a glass of wine in her hand. "But we didn't want to wake you. You looked so peaceful. And honestly, you needed the rest. You have been so confused lately." I looked at the shopping bags. "You went shopping?" I asked, squinting as if I couldn't quite bring them into focus. "Retail therapy," Stephanie said breezily, kicking a Gucci bag behind the sofa as if I wouldn't see it. "We needed to cheer ourselves up. It has been such a hard week." I looked at Jason. He wasn't shopping. He was standing near the window chewing on his thumbnail. He looked pale. He knew that if I didn't sign those Rolexes and handbags would be the least of their problems. He caught my eye and quickly looked away, terrified that I might ask him where he got the money. I didn't. I let the silence stretch, making them uncomfortable. I reached for the glass of water on the side table. I made my hand tremble. Not a lot, just enough to make the water slosh dangerously close to the rim. I brought it to my lips with two hands, sipping noisily. "I read the papers," I said softly. The room went dead silent. Brandon stopped admiring his watch. Stephanie froze with the shawl halfway around her neck. They all turned to look at me, predators, sensing weakness, and Brandon asked, his voice tight. I set the glass down deliberately, missing the coaster so it clinked against the wood. It is a very complicated contract." I said, my words slightly slurred. Lots of big words. Obsidian holdings. Easements. Liens. My head hurts just thinking about it. Brandon took a step forward, his face hardening. "Dad, we went over this. It is standard boilerplate. You don't need to understand every clause. You just need to trust us. We are doing this for the family. For Mom." I looked down at my hands, which were resting on my knees. I let them shake a little more violently this time. "I know," I said, sounding defeated. "I know. I miss her so much. And I don't want to fight anymore. I am too old for this. I just want everyone to be happy." Stephanie let out a breath she had been holding. "Does that mean you will do it, Daddy?" I looked up at them, widening my eyes to look earnest and pathetic. "Yes," I said. "I will sign." The relief in the room was physical. It hit me like a wave of heat. Tiffany squealed and clapped her hands. Brandon pumped his fist in the air. Even Jason sagged against the wall, looking like a man who had just been pulled off the gallows. "That is great, Dad," Brandon said, rushing over to help me stand, playing the dutiful son now that he had what he wanted. "That is the right decision. You won't regret it. We can do it right now. I have the pen." He reached into his pocket, but I raised my hand to stop him. "No," I said. "Not now. Not like this." Brandon froze. "What do you mean?" I looked around the messy living room at the takeout containers and the shopping bags. "Your mother, she loved celebrations," I said, my voice gathering a little strength, fueled by a fake sense of pride. "This is a big moment. $1 million. A new home. A legacy. I don't want to sign it on a coffee table covered in Chinese food." I stood up, leaning heavily on the armrest. "I want a party," I declared. "A party?" Stephanie asked, confused. "Yes, a signing ceremony. Tomorrow night. Friday night. Here. In this house." Brandon looked at his watch, calculating. Dad, the deadline is 5 p.m. The bank closes. I waved my hand dismissively. Oh, nonsense. Arthur Whitman can hold the papers in escrow. As long as it is signed and notarized by Friday night, the funds are committed. The electronic transfer can happen Monday. Your sellers will accept a notarized intent from a lawyer of Whitman's standing. I saw Brandon's mind working. He knew I was right. A notarized commitment from the executor backed by a law firm was as good as cash for a weekend hold. Okay, he said slowly. A party. We can do that. Just us. No, I said, straightening my back just a fraction. I want people to see this. I want to be proud of you. I want everyone to know that the Caldwell children are successful. I turned to Brandon. I want you to invite your boss, the president of your real estate firm, Mr. Sterling, isn't it? Brandon blinked. Sterling. Why would you want him here? Because he should see what a go-getter you are, I said, smiling, a senile, proud smile. Buying a multi-million-dollar property from your own firm, that shows initiative. It shows you believe in the product. He will be impressed. Invite him. Tell him I insist on thanking him personally for mentoring you. Brandon puffed up his chest. His ego was his Achilles heel, and I had just shot an arrow straight into it. You are right, Dad. Sterling would be impressed. He loves closing deals. I will call his assistant in the morning. Good, I said. And Jason? Jason jumped as I said his name. Yeah, Dad. You invite your investors, I said. Jason turned the color of ash. My who? Your investment partners, I said innocently. The ones who helped you with the earnest money. The ones you were talking about. You should invite them. Show them that their investment is safe. Show them you are a man of your word. They will appreciate seeing the paperwork signed with their own eyes, won't they? I watched the realization dawn on Jason's face. He was terrified of the loan sharks, but he was also terrified of losing the deal. If he invited them, if he showed them the money was guaranteed, maybe they wouldn't break his legs. Maybe they would view it as a VIP treatment. He nodded, swallowing hard. Yeah, he croaked. Yeah, that might actually be a good idea. To reassure them. And Stephanie, I added, turning to my daughter. Invite your friends. The ones on Instagram. The ones who follow your life. Let's make it a real event. Catering. Champagne. The best. Stephanie's eyes lit up. A party. A content opportunity. She was already mentally picking out filters. Oh, Daddy, that is a wonderful idea. I know the best caterer in Greenwich. I can get them on short notice if I pay extra. Pay extra, I said, spreading my arms. It is only money, right? And we are about to be rich. They were giddy now. They were drunk on the idea of it. They didn't see the trap. They didn't see that I was asking them to gather the judge, the jury, and the executioners all in one room. They just saw an old man's vanity. We will make it happen, Dad, Tiffany said, hugging me. She smelled of expensive wine and deceit. It will be beautiful, just like Catherine would have wanted. Yes, I said, patting her hand. Exactly like she would have wanted. Now, if you will excuse me, I am very tired. The vitamins, they make me sleepy. I emphasized the word vitamins, looking straight at Brandon. He didn't flinch. He just smiled that shark smile. Go to sleep, Dad. We will handle everything. I walked to my bedroom, leaning on the wall for support. As I closed the door, I heard the explosion of activity in the living room. Brandon was already on the phone, leaving a voicemail for his CEO. Jason was huddled in the corner, whispering frantically to someone, likely begging the Sharks to come to a nice dinner instead of a back alley beating. Stephanie was discussing canapes and lighting with Tiffany. They were planning their own wake. I sat down on my bed and let out a long, steady breath. My hands weren't shaking anymore. The tremor I had faked for them was gone. I pulled the encrypted USB drive out of my pocket and tucked it under my pillow. Tomorrow night the house would be full. The champagne would flow. The music would play. And in front of his boss, in front of his creditors, in front of their social circle, I was going to pull the rug out from under them so hard they would feel the impact for the rest of their lives. I lay down, closing my eyes. I wasn't going to need vitamins to sleep tonight. The anticipation was the only sedative I needed. Sleep well, my children, I thought. Tomorrow the Supreme Guardian takes the stage. Friday afternoon arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum hanging low and heavy over the neighborhood. Inside my house, however, the atmosphere was aggressively, blindingly bright. The transformation had begun at noon, and by 4 o'clock, the home I had shared with Catherine for 40 years had been turned into a stage set for a Vanity Fair. I stayed in my bedroom, the door locked, but the noise of the occupation seeped through the wood. I heard the sharp, efficient commands of the catering manager directing his staff. I heard the heavy thud of rental furniture being moved in gold Chiavari chairs that would scratch the hardwood floor's high-top cocktail tables draped in shimmering silk. The smell of roasted garlic and truffle oil began to waft under the door, overpowering the lingering scent of lavender that usually defined this house. It smelled like a hotel lobby. It smelled like money being burned. I stood before my full-length mirror. On the bed behind me lay my suit. It wasn't a tuxedo. It wasn't the midnight blue designer piece Brandon had tried to thrust upon me earlier that morning, claiming it would make me look like a statesman. It was my black wool suit. The elbows were slightly shiny from wear. The lapels were a little too wide for current fashion. It was the suit I had worn 3 days ago to bury my wife. It was the only thing I was willing to wear. I picked up my shoe-polish tin and a soft rag. I sat on the edge of the bed and began to work the wax into the leather of my dress shoes. Circular motions, small, precise circles. The repetition was calming. It was a ritual of order in a world that had gone chaotic. My children were out there preparing for a coronation, putting on costumes of success to hide the rot beneath. I was preparing for an execution. As I buffed the leather to a mirror shine, I thought about the contrast. Out there in the living room, a champagne tower was being constructed. I had heard the distinct clinking of crystal glasses being stacked one upon the other, a fragile pyramid of glass waiting for a single vibration to bring it crashing down. It was such a perfect metaphor for their lives that I almost laughed. Brandon and Stephanie were likely in the guest rooms getting dressed. I could imagine Brandon adjusting his cufflinks, checking his reflection, practicing his winning smile for his boss. I could imagine Stephanie squeezing into a gown she couldn't afford, applying layers of makeup to hide the reality of her face. They were putting on armor made of silk and diamonds. I finished with the shoes and set them on the floor. They gleamed in the dim light. I put on my white shirt, buttoning it all the way to the neck. I tied my black tie. Simple, somber. I walked to my desk in the corner of the room. My laptop was open, the screen glowing softly. I had 2 email drafts open. The first was addressed to Special Agent Thomas Miller at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Tom and I had worked together on a bank fraud case in the 90s. He was nearing retirement now, a man who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. The subject line read, "Priority Evidence of Securities Fraud and Money Laundering, Obsidian Holdings." I attached the folder containing the forensic image of Jason's hard drive, the emails from Brandon's work account, and the schematics of the shell company structure. I added a brief note. "Tom, this is Harrison. The apple has fallen very far from the tree, and it is rotten. The documentation is complete. You will find the trail leads directly to the escrow account opening tonight. Do what you have to do." I clicked send. The progress bar zipped across the screen. Sent. The second email was to Sarah Jenkins, a senior investigative reporter for the Financial Times. She had a reputation for destroying white-collar criminals who thought they were untouchable. The subject line was Tip Real Estate Ponzi Scheme Involving Licensed Broker. I attached the same files but highlighted the internal memos where Brandon bragged about offloading toxic assets to family trusts. I clicked send. The digital birds had flown. The cage door was closed. There was no taking it back now. I felt a strange lightness in my chest, a release of pressure. It wasn't malice. It was the satisfaction of balancing a ledger that had been in the red for far too long. A sharp, impatient knock on my bedroom door shattered the silence. "Dad, are you dressed yet?" It was Stephanie. Her voice was muffled by the wood, but the shrill edge of anxiety was clear. "I am getting ready," I replied, my voice calm. "Open the door." "Dad," she insisted, rattling the knob. I walked over and unlocked it. Stephanie stood in the hallway, and for a moment I didn't recognize her. She was wearing a floor-length gown, covered in silver sequins that caught the light like disco balls. Her hair was piled high on her head, stiff with hairspray. She looked like she was going to the Oscars, not a contract signing in a suburban living room. Behind her, the hallway was bustling with servers carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres. She looked me up and down, and her face crumpled with disappointment. "Oh, Daddy, no. You are wearing that." She gestured at my black suit with a hand weighed down by a diamond bracelet that I knew was rented. "That is the suit you wore to the funeral," she hissed, lowering her voice so the caterers wouldn't hear. "It is depressing. It is old. You look like an undertaker." I smoothed the lapel of my jacket. "I thought it was respectful," I said mildly. "Respectful?" She rolled her eyes. "It is a celebration, Dad. We are buying a mansion. We are starting a new chapter. You need to look the part. Brandon bought you that navy tuxedo. Where is it? Put it on. Please. Do not embarrass us tonight. Mr. Sterling is going to be here in an hour." She reached out to pluck at my sleeve, trying to herd me back toward the closet. I didn't move. I stood my ground, my feet planted in my freshly polished shoes. "I am not changing, Stephanie." But why she whined, her composure slipping. "Why do you have to be so difficult?" I looked her in the eye. Underneath the heavy makeup, I could see the little girl who used to cry when she didn't get the pony she wanted. She hadn't changed. She had just gotten more expensive toys. "I will wear the thing that is most appropriate for the event tonight," I said. She didn't understand. She thought I was being stubborn. She didn't realize that I was dressed for a funeral because I was about to bury their futures. "Fine," she snapped, turning away in a huff of sequins and perfume. "Just stay in here until we call you. Don't come out and wander around looking like a ghost. Wait for the cue. Brandon wants to introduce you properly." She stomped down the hall, shouting at a waiter who was moving too slowly. I closed the door again, but I didn't lock it this time. The time for hiding was over. I walked back to my nightstand. There, in a simple wooden frame, was the last photo I had taken of Catherine. It was in the garden just a few months ago. She was wearing her gardening gloves and a sun hat, smiling at the camera with dirt on her cheek. She looked happy. She looked real. I picked up the frame. "I am sorry it has to be this way, Kat," I whispered. "I tried to teach them. We both did. But some lessons can only be learned when you hit the bottom." I kissed my fingertips and pressed them against the glass. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the USB drive. It was small, silver, innocuous. It contained the ruin of my family. I opened my jacket. On the left side, right over my heart, was the interior breast pocket. I slipped the drive inside. It sat there, a cold, hard weight against my ribs. I checked my watch. 6:30. The guests would be arriving soon. Mr. Sterling, the investors, the sharks in expensive suits. They were all coming to see a show. I adjusted my tie one last time. I looked at the old man in the mirror. He didn't look frail anymore. He looked ready. I sat down in the chair by the window and waited for the music to start. The clock on the hallway wall chimed 8 times, but the sound was drowned out by the swell of a live jazz quartet playing in my living room. I opened my bedroom door and stepped out into the corridor. The transformation of my home was complete. It didn't look like the place where I had raised a family anymore. It looked like a showroom for a life I never wanted. I walked toward the living room. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the heavy, savory aroma of lobster canapés being passed around on silver trays. The crowd was dense. There were at least 50 people packed into the space. I recognized some of them. There was Mr. Sterling Brandon's CEO, a man with a tan that looked painted on and teeth that were too white. He was holding court near the fireplace, laughing loudly at something Brandon was saying. Then there were the others. The men standing near the patio doors. They wore suits that cost more than my car, but the fabric couldn't hide the bulk of muscle underneath. They didn't hold their champagne glasses by the stem. They gripped them by the bowl like weapons. These were Jason's investors, the loan sharks. They weren't here to celebrate. They were here to collect. I navigated through the sea of silk and wool. I felt like a ghost haunting my own house. People glanced at me and looked away immediately, their eyes sliding over my black funeral suit, as if it were a stain on the decor. No one offered me a drink. No one offered me a seat. A waiter brushed past me with a tray of crab cakes maneuvering around me, as if I were a piece of furniture that had been placed inconveniently in the walkway. I saw Stephanie across the room. She was holding her phone high, live-streaming the event to her followers. "Look at this turnout," she was saying to the screen, pouting her lips. "We are so blessed." New beginnings. Caldwell Manor. She saw me approach, and her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she turned her back, pretending to be engrossed in conversation with a woman I didn't know. She didn't want her followers to see the Grim Reaper standing behind her. Brandon spotted me. He excused himself from Mr. Sterling and strode over, his face flushed with alcohol and triumph. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask if I needed anything. He grabbed my elbow with a grip that was tight enough to bruise. "There he is," Brandon announced, his voice booming over the chatter. He steered me towards the center of the room like a prize steer at a county fair. "Everyone, I want you to meet the man of the hour. My father, Harrison Caldwell." The conversation lulled. 50 pairs of eyes turned to look at me. I stood there, letting my shoulders slump slightly, keeping my face blank and confused. "He is a little overwhelmed," Brandon continued, chuckling as if we shared a private joke. "He is getting up there in years, you know how it is. A bit foggy in the mornings and evenings." A ripple of polite, cruel laughter went through the room. But Brandon added, squeezing my arm tighter, "His heart is in the right place. He is the generous soul making this whole transition possible. He insists on financing the legacy." "Don't you, Dad?" I blinked rapidly behind my glasses, playing the part. "Yes," I murmured, barely audible. "Legacy. Important." Brandon beamed at the crowd. "See? A man of few words, but big checks." The crowd laughed again, louder this time. They weren't laughing with me. They were laughing at the senile old ATM who was about to sign away his fortune. I looked at Jason. He was standing near the sharks, giving them a nervous thumbs up. They didn't smile back. They just stared at me, calculating the odds. Just then, the front door opened. A hush fell over the room as Arthur Whitman entered. He was followed by 2 large men in dark suits who positioned themselves quietly by the entrance. Security. Arthur wasn't taking chances. Arthur looked out of place amidst the revelry. He held a leather briefcase against his chest like a shield. He scanned the room until he found me. Our eyes met. I gave him a barely perceptible nod. "It is time." Brandon saw the lawyer and his eyes lit up. He released my arm and clapped his hands together. "All right, everyone," Brandon shouted. "Kill the music." The jazz band stopped abruptly. The room fell silent save for the clinking of ice in glasses. Brandon walked to the center of the room near the fireplace where a small podium had been set up. It was ridiculous. He treated this like a press conference. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Brandon began, his voice smooth and practiced. "This has been a difficult week for the Caldwell family. We lost our matriarch, Catherine, but we know she is looking down on us tonight, smiling. Because tonight, we aren't just mourning. We are building. We are securing the future she wanted for us." He gestured to me. "My father has graciously agreed to release the family trust to acquire the Lakeview estate, a home where we will all live together, honoring Mom's memory. It is a historic moment for us." He turned to Arthur. "Mr. Whitman, if you have the papers." Arthur walked forward. He didn't look at Brandon. He placed the briefcase on the high-top table next to the podium. He clicked the latches open. The sound was loud in the quiet room. He pulled out a thick stack of documents bound in blue legal covers. He laid them out. Brandon beamed. He looked at me. "Come on up, Dad. Let's make it official." The crowd applauded politely. Stephanie aimed her phone at me. Jason wiped sweat from his forehead. I took a step forward, then another. I walked slowly, letting the suspense build. I could feel the USB drive burning against my chest. I reached the podium. Brandon tried to hand me a gold-plated pen he must have bought for the occasion. "Here you go, Dad. Just sign where the sticky notes are. I already read it for you." I looked at the pen. I looked at Brandon. I looked at the crowd of strangers drinking my wine and eating my food while my wife lay in fresh dirt. I didn't take the pen. I reached past him and took the microphone from the stand. Brandon's smile faltered. "Dad, you don't need to make a speech. Let's just—" I ignored him. I gripped the microphone. My hand was steady. Rock steady. The tremor was gone. I straightened my spine, standing to my full height of 6 feet. The stoop of age vanished. I lifted my chin and looked out at the room. My eyes locked onto Mr. Sterling, then the loan sharks, then my children. The confused, foggy look in my eyes evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard stare of a man who used to make CEOs sweat in depositions. "Before I sign," I said, my voice booming through the speakers, clear and authoritative, "I have a small gift I want to share with you all. A presentation, if you will." Brandon looked confused. "A presentation? Dad, we didn't plan." I reached into my jacket pocket. I pulled out the remote control for the oversized television mounted above the fireplace, the one they had been using to display a slideshow of the new house. I pointed the remote at the screen. "I think you will find this very illuminating," I said. I pressed the button. The picture of the mansion disappeared. The screen went black for a second. And then the first slide appeared. The giant screen above the fireplace flickered once, casting a harsh blue light over the darkened room. The jazz quartet had packed up their instruments, and the silence that filled the space was heavy with anticipation. 50 people held their breath, their eyes darting between me standing at the podium and the massive television. Brandon smiled nervously, adjusting his tie, clearly expecting a photo montage of family memories, or perhaps an architectural flyover of the new estate. He was wrong. The first slide appeared with digital clarity. It was the Instagram photo. The one Stephanie had deleted, but not before I had saved it forever. There they were, blown up to 60 inches of high-definition betrayal. Stephanie holding her champagne glass, her mouth open in a laugh that looked grotesque, frozen in time. Brandon leaning over the balcony, the bottle of Dom Perignon cradled in his arm like a newborn baby. But I had added something to the image. In bright red text overlaid across the bottom were the metadata details I had extracted. Date, November 14th. Time 2:15 p.m. Location, Lakeview Estate balcony. A collective gasp ripped through the room. It started near the front and rolled backward like a wave. Everyone knew what that time meant. Everyone knew where I was at 2:15 on November 14th. I leaned into the microphone, my voice calm, almost conversational. While I was throwing the first handful of dirt onto my wife's casket in the freezing rain, my children were 15 miles away, toasting to their new fortune. I looked at Stephanie. All the color had drained from her face. Her hands flew to her mouth, but she couldn't stop the small, strangled noise that escaped her throat. She looked around the room, seeing the shock and disgust registering on the faces of her followers, her friends, the people she tried so hard to impress. The facade of the grieving, devoted daughter shattered instantly, leaving behind only the ugly reality of her greed. This is what they call mourning in the Caldwell household. I continued, my eyes hard. Champagne and real estate shopping while the body is still warm. Brandon stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. Dad. Wait, you don't understand. That was from months ago. That is an old photo. I didn't argue. I just pressed the button on the remote. The screen changed. Slide 2. It wasn't a photo. It was a spreadsheet, a bank statement. But it wasn't just any statement. It was a forensic reconstruction of Jason's financial ruin. The numbers were stark black against a white background, with the negative balances highlighted in crimson. Trading account balance negative $512,000. Below that, I had scanned and enlarged the handwritten promissory notes Jason had signed. The terms were predatory. The interest rates were illegal. And the names at the bottom were not banks. They were street names. I looked at the group of large men standing by the patio doors. They weren't drinking their champagne anymore. They were staring at the screen, and then they were staring at Jason. Their eyes narrowed. They realized in that split second that Jason wasn't a wealthy investor waiting for a trust fund payout. He was a gambler who had lost everything, including the money he owed them. These gentlemen in the back, I said, gesturing to the sharks with the remote. My son-in-law told me you were his investment partners. But looking at these notes, it seems you are actually his owners. Jason made a sound like a dying animal. He slumped against the wall, his legs giving out. He looked at the men, pleading silently with his eyes, but they didn't look back. They were already calculating how to cut their losses, and Jason looked terrified that the cost would be physical. He borrowed $100,000 from you to put a deposit on a house he couldn't afford, I explained to the room. He told you he was good for it. He told you the trust would cover it. He lied. The room was buzzing now. The polite veneer of the party had evaporated. Guests were whispering frantically, pulling out their phones to record the disaster. Mr. Sterling, Brandon's boss, looked confused, his tan face frowning as he tried to make sense of the chaos. I pressed the button again. Slide 3. This was the kill shot. It was the email chain from Brandon's work account. I had highlighted the most damning sections in yellow. From Brandon Caldwell to Regional Director. Subject: distressed asset liquidation, Lakeview. I have found a buyer for the toxic asset at Lakeview. It is a family trust. The executor is elderly and compliant. We can offload the property at full asking price plus a 20% premium and wipe the foreclosure debt off our books. The inspection reports regarding the foundation, cracks, and black mold have been buried in the appendix. He won't read them. I let the words hang there on the screen. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a bomb having detonated right before the shockwave hits. Mr. Sterling stepped closer to the screen, squinting. He read the words. He read his own employee bragging about defrauding a client who happened to be his own father. I turned to Brandon. He was shaking his head, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Dad. No, that is taken out of context. That is a joke. It is industry talk. I spoke into the microphone and my voice thundered. It wasn't an old man's voice. It was the voice of the man who had audited Fortune 500 companies and sent CEOs to federal prison. You think I am a senile old man, Brandon. You think because I walk slow and grieve my wife, my brain has turned to mush. You think you could switch my blood pressure pills for vitamins, and I wouldn't notice. A gasp went through the room at the mention of the pills. I am a forensic auditor with 40 years of experience, I roared. I have spent my life hunting liars, thieves, and frauds. I can smell a scheme like this from a mile away. I smelled it the moment you walked into my house with mud on your shoes and a crowbar in your hand. I pointed the remote at him like a weapon. You didn't just try to steal my money. You tried to sell me a rotting house to save your own career. You tried to use your mother's legacy to cover up your own incompetence. Brandon's face turned a violent shade of purple. The humiliation was total. His boss was watching. His friends were watching. His carefully constructed world of lies was disintegrating on a 60-inch screen. He snapped. He let out a guttural roar of rage and lunged at me. He didn't look like my son anymore. He looked like a cornered beast. "Turn it off!" he screamed, his hands reaching for the microphone for the remote for my throat. "You are ruining everything." But he never reached me. Arthur Whitman had prepared for this. Two men in dark suits who had been standing quietly by the wall moved with terrifying speed. They intercepted Brandon 2 feet from the podium. One of them grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him down to his knees. Brandon cried out in pain and shock, his face pressed against the hardwood floor he had hoped to inherit. Tiffany shrieked a high, piercing sound that shattered the last remnants of civility. "Turn it off!" she screamed, grabbing a bottle of champagne and throwing it at the television. It missed, shattering against the stone fireplace, spraying glass and expensive foam over the front row of guests. "He is lying. He is crazy. He hacked our computers. This is illegal." I didn't flinch. I stood over my son, who was pinned to the ground, and looked at the crowd. "I am not crazy," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. "I am just disappointed. And I am finished." I dropped the remote onto the podium. The screen remained frozen on the email, the yellow highlighted text burning into everyone's retinas. "The executor is elderly and compliant." I looked at Arthur Whitman. He nodded. He opened the blue folder on the table. The show was over. Now it was time for the verdict. I stood at the podium, the microphone still humming with the echo of my accusation. The room was frozen in a tableau of shock. Brandon was on his knees, pinned by the security guards, his face a mask of disbelief and pain. Stephanie was sobbing quietly, her mascara running in black rivers down her cheeks, ruining the makeup she had spent hours perfecting. Jason was pressed against the wall, shrinking away from the men in suits who were now watching him with the predatory focus of wolves spotting a wounded deer. Arthur Whitman stepped forward. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at me. He opened the blue folder he had carried in the one containing the original unredacted trust instrument. He placed it gently on the podium, right over the remote control I had discarded. There was one final document to sign. I reached down and picked up the gold-plated pen Brandon had tried to force into my hand earlier. It felt heavy, ostentatious, a tool, designed for vanity, not for business. I held it up to the light, letting the gold glint for a moment, letting them think, just for a fraction of a second, that maybe I was bluffing. Maybe I was just an angry old man making a scene before surrendering. Brandon lifted his head, a flicker of desperate hope igniting in his eyes. "Dad," he wheezed, struggling against the guard's grip. "Dad, please, just sign it. We can fix this. We can explain. Just sign the release." I looked at him. I looked at the contract for the Lakeview estate that was still sitting on the table, the fraudulent paperwork he had prepared to steal his mother's legacy. I moved the pen toward the paper. Brandon let out a breath. Stephanie stopped crying and leaned forward. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, I stabbed the pen through the center of the contract. The nib tore through the thick paper and scratched deep into the wood of the podium. The sound was sharp and final. I ripped the pen sideways, tearing the document in half. Then I grabbed the pieces with my hands and shredded them. Once, twice, 3 times. I let the confetti of their dreams rain down onto Brandon's head. "I am not signing your release, Brandon," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I am signing something else entirely." I picked up the blue document Arthur had laid out. I turned to the last page. I signed my name. Harrison Caldwell. The signature was bold, sweeping, devoid of the tremor I had feigned for days. "What did you just sign?" Stephanie screamed, her voice shrill with panic. "What is that?" I looked at the crowd addressing the witnesses to this execution. "My wife Catherine knew you better than you know yourselves," I said. 6 months ago, she added a clause to her trust. It is called the Supreme Guardian Clause. It gave me the sole unilateral power to determine if her beneficiaries were morally and financially fit to inherit. I paused, letting the legal weight of those words sink in. If I determined you were not fit, I had the power to redirect the entire corpus of the trust, every single cent. Jason slid down the wall, hitting the floor with a thud. He knew what was coming. "Tonight you proved her right," I continued. "You broke into my home. You tried to defraud me. You poisoned me with fake medicine. You leveraged your own mother's death for a real estate commission." I pointed a finger at Brandon. "You are not fit." I pointed at Stephanie. "You are not fit. And you," I said, looking at Jason, "you are a liability." I turned back to the microphone. "Therefore, as the supreme guardian of the Catherine Caldwell Trust, I have made a decision. At 5 o'clock this afternoon, while you were dressing up for this party, while you were putting on your jewels and drinking my wine, I authorized a wire transfer." Brandon struggled, his face turning a mottled red. "Transfer? Transfer to where?" "That is my money. You can't move it." "It is already gone, son," I said softly. The wire cleared at 5:30. "The account balance is 0. Stephanie shrieked. "0? Where is it? Where is the $1 million? I smiled. It was a cold, hard smile. "I donated it," I said. "Every penny. The entire $1 million has been gifted to the Catherine Caldwell Legal Aid Fund. It is a new nonprofit dedicated to providing legal defense for elderly people who are being financially abused by their own families." The irony hit them like a physical blow. Their inheritance would now be used to fight people exactly like them. No, Brandon roared, a sound of pure animalistic agony. "You crazy old bat. You burned it. You burned $1 million. "I didn't burn it," I corrected him. "I planted it. It will grow into something good, something you never would have created." But I wasn't done. I had one more bomb to drop, one more lesson to teach. I looked around the room at the expensive furniture, the high ceilings, the home I had built with Catherine. "And there is one last piece of business," I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a set of keys. My house keys. "This house," I said, holding them up. "You thought you could sell it. You told me to find a small apartment. You told me I was a burden. Well, you don't have to worry about the house anymore. Because I sold it." Stephanie's jaw dropped. You what?" "I sold it this afternoon," I said. "To a cash buyer. A developer who wants the land. I signed the closing documents at 4:30. It was an expedited sale. As is. Immediate possession." I checked my watch. Technically, this house belongs to him now, but I negotiated a grace period. The new owner is coming with his crew at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning to change the locks and begin the demolition. The room erupted. Guests began to scramble, realizing they were partying in a house that was essentially condemned. 8 a.m. I repeated, my voice cutting through the noise. That gives you exactly 12 hours. 12 hours to get your clothes, your bags, and your rented luxury goods out of here. Whatever is left at 801 goes into the dumpster. Brandon stopped struggling. He went limp in the guard's arms. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him. No money, no house, no commission. And then his pocket started to vibrate. It was his phone. In the silence of his defeat, the ringtone was obnoxiously loud. It was a generic upbeat melody that sounded grotesque in the current atmosphere. "Answer it, Brandon," I said. "It might be important." The guard released one of his arms. Brandon reached into his pocket with a trembling hand and pulled out the phone. He looked at the screen. His face went white. It is HR," he whispered. "Why is HR calling me at 9 on a Friday?" I looked at Mr. Sterling, who was standing near the fireplace, his face a mask of fury. He was holding his own phone, having just ended a call. He looked at Brandon with disgust. "Because I just fired you," Brandon Sterling barked across the room. Brandon flinched. "What?" "Sir, I saw the emails," Sterling shouted. "Your father sent them to me. You tried to sell a toxic asset to a family trust. You tried to defraud the firm. You are done. Legal is drafting the termination letter now. Don't bother coming in to clear your desk. Security will mail you a box." Brandon dropped the phone. It hit the floor and cracked the screen, spiderwebbing, just like his life. Across the room, Jason was trying to inch toward the patio door, trying to slip away into the night. But the sharks were faster. Two of the large men stepped in front of him, blocking his path. They didn't touch him. They didn't have to. One of them leaned down and whispered something in Jason's ear. I didn't hear what he said, but I saw Jason's knees buckle. He grabbed the edge of a table to keep from falling, his eyes wide with the terror of a man who knows his time has run out. He looked at me, mouthing the word, "Help." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had gambled away my daughter's security and tried to pay for it with my blood. I didn't blink. I didn't nod. I just looked away. Stephanie was on the floor now, surrounded by her shopping bags, weeping into the cashmere shawl she had bought hours ago. She was muttering about where she would go, about how she couldn't be homeless, about what her followers would think. It was a scene of total, absolute devastation, and I had orchestrated every second of it. I stepped down from the podium. The crowd parted for me instantly, creating a wide berth. They looked at me with fear. They looked at me with awe. They realized that the old man in the cheap funeral suit was the most dangerous person in the room. I walked past Brandon. He was staring at the floor, broken. "Dad," he whispered. "Dad, please." I didn't stop. I walked past Stephanie. She reached out a hand to grab my pant leg. "Daddy, wait," she sobbed. I stepped out of her reach. I walked to the front door. The air outside was cold and clean. The rain had stopped. I stepped onto the porch and took a deep breath. Behind me, the house was dissolving into chaos. I could hear shouting, crying, the sound of breaking glass. I walked down the steps and onto the driveway. A taxi was waiting for me at the curb, its yellow light glowing in the darkness. I had called it 10 minutes ago. I opened the door and slid into the back seat. "Where to, pal?" the driver asked, eyeing my suit in the rearview mirror. "The airport," I said. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look back at the ruin of my family. I looked forward at the road stretching out under the streetlights. I had buried my wife on Tuesday. On Friday, I had buried my children. It was a heavy week. But as the car pulled away, leaving the nightmare behind, I felt lighter than I had in years. The audit was closed. The books were balanced. And for the first time in a long time, the numbers finally added up. The morning sun broke over the horizon at exactly 6:58, casting a pale, unforgiving light onto the street I used to call home. I sat in the back of the yellow taxi, my suitcase resting on the seat beside me. I had spent the night at a hotel near the airport, sleeping the deep, dreamless sleep of a man who has finally set down a heavy load. But I couldn't leave, not yet. I needed to see it. I needed to witness the final act of the play I had written. "Driver," I said, leaning forward, "take me by Elm Street before we hit the highway." He grunted an affirmation and turned the wheel. As we turned onto the familiar block, I saw them. It was 8 a.m. on the dot. The scene in front of my old house looked like the aftermath of a natural disaster, if that disaster was caused entirely by hubris. The front lawn, usually pristine, was littered with the debris of a hasty eviction. There were suitcases thrown haphazardly onto the grass. Louis Vuitton trunks sat in the mud. Garment bags lay in heaps like fallen soldiers. And there were my children. They were sitting on the curb, huddled together against the morning chill. They looked nothing like the masters of the universe they had pretended to be the night before. Stephanie was wrapped in her cashmere shawl, but it was stained with wine and dirt. Her makeup was smeared across her face in dark, raccoon-like streaks. She wasn't wearing her heels anymore. She was barefoot, her toes curled against the cold asphalt. Brandon sat next to her, his head in his hands. His expensive suit was wrinkled and unbuttoned. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, a deflated balloon of a man. The Porsche was gone. I assumed the leasing company or the creditors had come for it in the dark hours of the morning, dragging it away while he watched helplessly. Jason was nowhere to be seen. He had likely run the moment the sun came up, trying to put distance between himself and the debts he couldn't pay. A large white van was parked in the driveway. 2 men in coveralls were changing the locks on the front door. The new owner didn't waste time. I told the driver to stop. The car idled at the curb, the engine purring softly. I pressed the button and lowered the window. The mechanical whir was the only sound in the quiet morning. Stephanie looked up. When she saw me, her face crumpled. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling a little, and ran toward the car. She looked desperate, pathetic, a child who had broken a vase and was terrified of the punishment. "Daddy," she wailed, grabbing the door handle. "Daddy, please. You can't leave us here. We have nowhere to go. They locked us out. They threw our bags on the lawn." I looked at her. I looked at the house. I looked at Brandon, who had lifted his head but couldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at his shoes, shame radiating off him in waves. "Daddy," Stephanie sobbed, pressing her face close to the open window. "We are sorry." "Okay. We messed up. We know we were wrong. But please, just help us this one last time. We don't have cash for a hotel. Our cards are declined. Just give us a little something to get by. Just until we sort this out. Please." She still didn't get it. She thought this was a negotiation. She thought she could cry her way back into the bank vault. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. Stephanie's eyes widened. She stopped crying for a second, a flicker of greed lighting up her tear-stained face. She thought I was reaching for my checkbook. She thought I was reaching for cash. Brandon stood up, then watching me, a glimmer of hope rising in his chest. He took a step toward the car, thinking that the old man had cracked, that the fatherly instinct to protect had overridden the auditor's instinct to punish. I pulled out a thick white envelope. It was sealed. Stephanie reached for it, her fingers grasping. I handed it to her. "Here," I said softly. "This is for you, and for Brandon." She tore it open, her hands shaking. Brandon crowded in behind her, looking over her shoulder. They expected a check. They expected a lifeline. Stephanie pulled out the contents. It wasn't money. It was a stack of brochures I had collected from the community center weeks ago, anticipating a day like this might come, though hoping it never would. The top brochure was glossy and blue. It read, "Pathways to Employment, Local Job Placement Services." Beneath that was a pamphlet for a staffing agency that specialized in entry-level clerical work. And at the bottom, stapled to a list of affordable weekly rate motels, was a card for Gamblers Anonymous and a legal aid clinic for bankruptcy filings. Stephanie stared at the papers. She flipped them over, looking for the check that wasn't there. She looked at the empty envelope. She looked at me, her mouth hanging open in shock. "What is this?" she whispered. "Is this a joke?" I looked her dead in the eye. "It is not a joke, Stephanie. It is a start." I looked at Brandon. "You wanted a legacy son. You wanted to build something. Well, now is your chance. You are going to build your life from scratch just like I did, just like your mother did." Brandon flinched as if I had slapped him. "Dad," he choked out. "We have nothing. You have your health," I said. "You have your education, which I paid for. And now you have the most valuable thing I could ever give you." I paused, letting the words hang in the crisp morning air. "I have given you your independence." Stephanie threw the papers on the ground. "You are cruel," she screamed. "You are a horrible old man. How can you do this to your own family?" "I am doing it because I love you," I said. And for the first time in days, my voice trembled with genuine emotion. "I am doing it because if I give you money now, you will never learn. You will be parasites until the day you die. I am cutting the cord, Stephanie. You are free. You are free to succeed, and you are free to fail. But you will do it on your own dime." "Good luck," I said. I pressed the button. The window rolled up, sealing me inside the warm, safe bubble of the taxi. Stephanie banged on the glass, her mouth moving in silent screams, but I didn't look at her. I looked forward. "Driver to the airport, please." The taxi pulled away from the curb. I watched the house recede in the side mirror. I saw the small, diminishing figures of my children standing amidst their ruin. They looked lost. They looked terrified. But they were alive. And for the first time in their adult lives, they were going to have to figure out how to stay that way without my help. I sat back in the seat and closed my eyes. The knot of anxiety that had lived in my stomach for 6 months began to loosen. I was going to the airport. I had a one-way ticket in my pocket. Destination Rome, Italy. It was the trip Catherine and I had talked about for 40 years. We talked about it when we were newlyweds eating pasta in our tiny kitchen. We talked about it when the kids were babies. We talked about it when we retired. We always said, next year, when the kids are settled, when the market is better. Next year. But next year never came for her. I reached into my pocket and pulled out her passport. I had brought it with me. It was expired, but I needed it. I needed to feel like she was coming too. I looked out the window as the taxi merged onto the highway. The sky was a brilliant, piercing blue, the kind of blue you see in Renaissance paintings. The clouds were white and fluffy, drifting lazily toward the east. I felt a warmth on my shoulder like a hand resting there. It was probably just the sun coming through the glass, but I chose to believe it was something else. I smiled. A real smile. "We did it, Kat," I whispered to the empty seat beside me. "It was the hardest thing we ever had to do. Harder than the audits, harder than the lean years. But we did it. They are on their own now. They will hate us for a while, maybe for a long time. But maybe, just maybe one day, they will wake up in a small apartment they paid for with their own money, eating food they bought with their own wages, and they will understand. And if they don't, well, that is not our account to balance anymore." I patted the passport in my pocket. "Let's go get some gelato, my love," I said. "We have a lot of lost time to make up for." The taxi sped up, carrying me away from the wreckage of my past and toward the horizon. I was 70 years old. I was alone. But as I watched the planes taking off in the distance, climbing higher and higher into the blue, I realized I had never felt more free. The audit was over. The books were closed. and the rest of the ledger was mine to write. This journey taught me that money does not create character. It only reveals it. For years, Catherine and I thought we were helping our children by shielding them from struggle, but we were actually robbing them of their independence. True love is not about giving your children everything they want. Sometimes it is about having the courage to say no to save them from themselves. To anyone out there feeling invisible or used by the people you love, remember that your dignity is not negotiable. You are not a burden, and your life is not over. You have the power to rewrite your ending, even if it means turning the page on the people who refuse to respect you. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button to support the channel. Have you ever had to set a hard boundary with family to protect your own peace? I want to hear your story in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of truth and justice. Until next time.